He threw her out in the middle of winter. Not quietly, not with any shame. Harold Fenwick stood on the porch of the house Evelyn had kept for 11 years, scrubbed the floors of, patched the roof of, buried 2 children beside, and he pointed at the road like she was a stray dog he'd grown tired of feeding. "You got till sundown," he said. "After that, whatever's left inside is mine." He was her brother-in-law. He had waited exactly 4 days after her husband's burial to file the claim. The neighbors watched from their yards. Not one of them said a word. Evelyn picked up her bag. She did not cry in front of him. She decided that much, at least, was still hers to control. If you've ever been made to feel like nothing by someone who owed you everything, stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel and follow Evelyn's journey all the way to the end, because what comes next will show you what a woman with nothing left is truly capable of. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country you're watching. I want to see how far this story travels. The road out of Cheyenne ran northwest through country that didn't care whether you lived or died. Evelyn Hartwell had learned that early. She'd come to Wyoming as a young bride, 22 years old, and still carrying the softness of Ohio in her voice, and the land had spent the better part of a decade grinding that softness down to something leaner and harder and quieter. She didn't resent it for that. The frontier didn't make promises. It was the people who did the damage. She was 34 now, and she walked with the kind of stillness that comes from having already survived the worst things you could imagine surviving. Her husband Thomas had died of fever in March, 6 weeks before the ground thawed enough to bury him properly. Their daughter, born too soon and too small, had not made it past her first February. Their son had lived 8 months. Evelyn kept a lock of his hair in the inside pocket of her coat, folded into a square of flour sackcloth, and she had not opened it since the morning they put him in the ground, because she did not trust herself to close it again. Harold had not come to the funeral. He'd sent a letter instead, 3 pages of legal language about the deed to the property, and what Thomas had allegedly promised him years before any of it was worth promising. Evelyn had read it twice, then set it on the fire, which was the only response she could think of that didn't involve doing something she'd regret. She had kept working the land through spring, through summer, through fall, kept the chickens, kept the garden, kept the fences mended with wire and stubbornness. She told herself that if she just kept moving, just kept the work in front of her, the grief would stay behind her where it belonged. That's what her mother had told her once. Keep your hands busy, and your heart will follow. Her mother had also told her that family could be trusted. Harold arrived in November with a surveyor and a document that bore Thomas's signature, dated 2 years before Thomas died. 2 years before, the land was worth anything to anyone, back when the drought had nearly taken everything, and Thomas had been desperate enough to sign things he shouldn't have. Evelyn didn't know if the signature was real. She suspected it wasn't. She had no money for a lawyer, and the one man in Cheyenne who might have helped her had already been paid not to. So she took her bag. She walked northwest because that was the direction the wind was coming from, and she didn't want it at her back. She walked until the town was small behind her, and then she kept walking until it disappeared entirely. And there was nothing on either side of her but frozen grass, and the kind of silence that presses against your ears like hands. She had $7.40. She had the coat on her back and 2 dresses in the bag and a pair of work boots that were starting to separate at the left heel. She had the lock of her son's hair. She had whatever it was that had kept her standing through 11 years of Wyoming winters, and she was not entirely sure what to call it, but she was grateful it hadn't left her yet. The settlement of Grover's Flat was 12 miles up the road, if the man at the livery in Cheyenne had been telling the truth, and not just pointing her somewhere to get rid of her. She reached it by mid-afternoon, when the light was already going thin and gold, the way it does in November when the sun gives up early. It was smaller than she'd expected: a grain exchange, a dry goods store, a saloon, a church, and a scattering of houses that leaned into each other like they were trying to stay warm. The woman at the dry goods store told her about the ranch without being asked. Evelyn had only come in to buy a tin of boot grease, and she was standing at the counter counting out pennies when the woman, heavy-set, sharp gray eyes, and a way of looking at people that stripped them down to their particulars, said, "You looking for work or just passing through?" Evelyn looked up. "Work. What kind? Whatever kind there is." The woman studied her for a moment. "Blackthorn Ranch is taking on a barn hand, 2 miles east on the Laramie Road. But I'll tell you now, most people don't last a month out there. Cole Blackthorn's not what you'd call warm." "I'm not looking for warm," Evelyn said. She bought the boot grease and started east. The ranch came into view just as the last of the daylight was giving out a collection of dark buildings against a sky. Gone purple and gray, fences running out in every direction, like the property was trying to hold the land in place. There were lights in what she took to be the main house, small and steady behind curtained windows. The barn was larger than the house, which told her something about the man who owned the place. Some ranchers cared more for their livestock than their own comfort. That could mean a hard man or a practical one or both. She knocked at the side door of the barn rather than the house. A young ranch hand answered, 19, maybe 20, with straw in his hair and the expression of someone who was perpetually surprised to find the world expecting things of him. "I'm looking for Cole Blackthorn," she said. The boy stared at her bag, then at her face. "It's near dark. I can see that." He went to get his employer, leaving the door open in a way that suggested he hadn't decided yet whether this was worth interrupting supper for. Evelyn stood in the gap and looked at the barn interior, clean, well organized, the horses in their stalls quiet and settled. Someone here knew what they were doing with animals. The smell of fresh hay and wood shavings and horse was the first good thing she'd encountered all day. Cole Blackthorn came from the direction of the house, not the barn, which meant the boy had gone back across the yard to get him. He was taller than she'd expected, lean in the way of men who worked hard and didn't sit still long enough to fill out. He was somewhere in his early 40s, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had been outdoors. Long enough to forget it had ever been young. He was not a handsome man, exactly. He was a striking one, the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and decision, and probably a few years of not sleeping well. He looked at her the same way the woman at the dry goods store had. Cessed her without apology. "Margaret said you were looking for barn work," he said. "I am. You've done it before." It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. 11 years. I can muck stalls, turn hay, manage feed, identify foot rot and colic, and the first signs of respiratory infection. I can work with difficult horses. I've midwifed a mare through a complicated foaling on my own in the middle of the night, with nothing but a lantern and some rope. She paused. "I don't need much by way of accommodation. A dry place to sleep is sufficient." Cole Blackthorn looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The pay is $4 a week. You take your meals with the hands. The loft in the barn is warm enough if you bank the stove right." He paused. "And you stay away from the house." "Understood. I mean it. My children are in that house, and I don't want strangers coming and going." "How old are they?" Something shifted in his face, not warmth, exactly, but a tightening around the eyes that told her. The question landed somewhere real. 8, he said. "Both of them. Twins." She nodded. She did not say anything more about the children. She could tell it wasn't an invitation for more conversation, and she had spent enough years around wary men to know when pushing was a mistake. "When do I start?" "Now, if you're willing. 2 of the mares need brushing down, and the water buckets in the east wing need refilling." "All right." He started to turn away, then stopped. "What's your name?" "Evelyn Hartwell." He nodded once, like he was filing it somewhere he wasn't sure he'd need. "Don't cause trouble, Mrs. Hartwell." "I never do," she said, which was only partly true, but was at least the truest thing she could say tonight. He went back to his house. She went into the barn. She worked until well past 9, moving through the tasks with the automatic competence of someone who'd done this so many times that her hands knew what to do without waiting for her head. The horses settled around her with less fuss than she'd expected. There was a bay mare in the third stall who had been spooked by something and came in sidelong and blowing. And Evelyn just stood at the stall door and waited, not moving, not talking, just being there until the mare ran out of anxiety and came to investigate. That was always the way with frightened things. You couldn't rush them. You just had to be patient and smaller than the fear. She found her place in the loft, spread her blanket over the hay, and lay there, listening to the barn breathe around her. The horses shifted in their stalls below. The wind moved across the roof. Outside somewhere, something that might have been an owl. She opened the inside pocket of her coat and took out the square of flour sackcloth and held it in both hands without opening it. She had survived the worst thing she could imagine surviving. She reminded herself of that. She had made it through Thomas dying slowly in their bed, through the sound he made in the last hours when his breathing was just water and struggle. She had made it through 2 small graves. She had made it through Harold and his surveyor and his pointing finger and the neighbors who watched from their yards and said nothing. She was still here. The barn was warm. The hay smelled clean. Somewhere below her, the bay mare had finally stopped moving and was standing quiet in her stall. Wasn't much. But Evelyn Hartwell had learned long ago that you don't measure what you have against what you've lost. You measure it against nothing, against the road, against winter. By that measure, this was enough to start with. She put the cloth square back in her pocket and closed her eyes. She did not sleep well. She hadn't slept well in years, but she slept. In the morning she was up before the first gray light came through the gaps in the barn boards, and she had half the stalls mucked and refilled before any of the ranch hands arrived. The boy from the night before she'd learn later. His name was Denny came in at first light and stopped dead when he saw how much work had already been done. He stood there with his mouth slightly open. "Good morning," Evelyn said, and went back to work. Word moved fast on a small ranch. By noon, she could feel the other hands watching her without quite looking at her. There were 4 of them, ranging from Denny's age up to a weathered man named Cass, who had the slow, deliberate movements of someone whose joints had been arguing with him for decades. They were polite in the distant, careful way of men who haven't decided yet what to make of something new. She didn't push for more than that. She worked. She ate the noon meal with them in the bunkhouse. Without much conversation, she went back to work. What she noticed in those first days was the silence in the main house. She wasn't supposed to be noticing the main house at all. Cole Blackthorn had been clear about that, and she was not a woman who tested boundaries she'd agreed to respect. But the barn was close enough to the house that she could hear things sometimes. A door closing, a voice raised in the kitchen, the sound of boots on wooden floors. What she didn't hear were children, not playing, not arguing with each other the way 8-year-olds argue, which is constantly and about everything, not running. The house had a stillness to it that she recognized because she'd lived inside it herself, the particular quiet of a place where someone is trying very hard to hold things together, and the effort of it has crowded out everything else. She thought about this while she worked. She thought about Cole Blackthorn's face when she'd asked how old his children were, the way his jaw had tightened, not with irritation, but with the reflex of a man who had learned to guard the tender things. She didn't know what had happened to their mother. She didn't ask. It wasn't her business, and besides, she knew how those stories ended out here. Fever, childbirth, the land finding one of the 10,000 ways it had of taking people before their time. On her 5th morning at the ranch, she came into the barn before light as usual and found one of the horses down. Not just down in trouble. The big gray gelding in the end stall had gone colicky overnight, badly enough that he was sweating and rolling and his gums were going pale. She went to him without hesitating, got him up off the ground with voice and hands and considerable effort because he outweighed her by 1,000 pounds and didn't particularly want to cooperate. She walked him up and down the barn aisle, back and forth, keeping him moving, talking to him in the low, steady murmur she used with horses when they were scared or hurting, which was not really words so much as the intention of words, the sound of a human presence saying, "I'm here. I've got you. Keep moving." She was still walking him when Cole Blackthorn appeared in the barn doorway an hour later, dressed and awake, and clearly on to check on the animals before his own breakfast. Stopped. He looked at the horse. He looked at Evelyn. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "How long has he been like this?" "I found him down about 90 minutes ago. He's improving. The gut sounds are coming back on the left side." She kept walking, the gelding plodding beside her, with the exhausted cooperation of an animal that has burned through its panic and settled into endurance. "I didn't want to come to the house and wake you until I knew whether we were looking at a surgical emergency or something we could manage." Cole stood there watching for another moment. Something in his expression shifted not a lot, just a degree or two, like a compass needle adjusting to a new direction. "His name's Jasper," he said. "He's done this before." "I know, I could tell from how he came out of it. He's done it enough times that he's learned not to fight the pain as hard. Makes it easier to walk him." She paused at the end of the aisle and turned the horse, brought him back toward Cole. "If he does this again, it would help to have some mineral oil," Cole said. "I know. I've got some in the tack room. Then you've managed him through this before. More times than I'd like." He stepped aside to let her pass with the horse, then fell into step alongside her, without being invited to, and without asking permission. She walked. He walked. Jasper plodded between them, with his head low and his breathing evening out. After a while, Cole said, "Where'd you learn horses?" "My father had them, and I had them. 11 years on a spread east of Jishan. You learn or you lose them, and we couldn't afford to lose them." He nodded. He didn't ask about Cheyenne. She appreciated that. They walked Jasper together until his color was good, and his gut sounds were strong on both sides, and he was interested in hay again, which was the surest sign of recovery in a colicky horse, the moment when they decide the world is worth eating. Cole took the halter rope from her then, led the gelding back to his stall, and stood at the stall door for a moment, with his hand on the horse's neck, just resting it there. It was the first thing she'd seen him do that wasn't purely functional. The first moment when he seemed like a man and not just a set of tasks in a human shape. "Thank you," he said, still looking at the horse. "It's what I'm here for," she said. She meant it practically. He took it that way. But something had shifted between them in those 90 minutes of walking a sick horse back from the edge, and they both knew it, even if neither of them said so. She went back to the morning's work. The ranch hands noticed too. Not the shift, they wouldn't have the context for that, but the fact that Jasper was standing and eating instead of dead, or on his way to the knackers, and that Evelyn Hartwell had apparently pulled it off alone in the dark before any of them were awake. Cass, the oldest of them, came and stood in the barn doorway around mid-morning with a cup of coffee in his hand and just looked at her working for a while. "Jasper's a good horse," he said eventually. "He is," she agreed. "Lost a horse to colic 2 years back. Younger than Jasper. It happens fast if you're not watching." Cass drank his coffee. "You were watching," he said. She didn't answer that because it didn't need answering. That night, the loft felt a little less strange. Not comfortable, she wasn't someone who needed comfortable right now. And she wasn't fool enough to trust a place just because it had been kind to her for 5 days. But she lay with the flour sackcloth in her hands and listened to the barn and thought, not for the first time, and not for the last, that the only way through anything was the same way you got through a colicky horse or a Wyoming winter, or grief so heavy you thought it would push you flat into the ground. You kept moving. You stayed present. You did the next thing, and then the next thing after that. And sometimes, if you were very patient, the thing that was scared and suffering came around. The second week at Blackthorn Ranch, Evelyn learned that the twins had a habit of standing at the barn window. She noticed it the way she noticed most things sideways, without making a production of it. She'd be working the near end of the aisle and catch movement at the edge of her vision, a pale face pressed to the glass, breath fogging the cold pane. sometimes one face, sometimes two, side by side, nearly identical in the way they held their chins, and the particular stillness of children who have learned that watching is safer than approaching. She didn't wave. She didn't smile in that exaggerated way adults use with children they're trying to win over, the smile that always looks like an advertisement for itself. She just went back to whatever she was doing and let them look. She found out their names, from Denny, who talked more than any of the other hands, and didn't seem to notice that she asked questions by being quiet rather than by asking them. The girl was Clara. The boy was Samuel. Their mother had been dead 3 years, since just after the twins turned 5, and the official story was fever, though Denny lowered his voice when he said it, in a way that suggested the real story was more complicated, and probably not his to tell. Mr. Blackthorn takes care of them himself, Denny said. Well, he tries. He's better with cattle than he is with. He seemed to realize he was talking about his employer and closed his mouth. People. Evelyn finished without judgment. Denny looked relieved that she'd said it so he didn't have to. He's not mean or anything. He works a lot. Understood that. She had married a man who worked a lot. It was one of the things she had loved about Thomas, and also one of the things that had meant, in the hard years, that she was frequently alone in ways that work couldn't fill. The children continued to appear at the window. After a few days, she started noticing the pattern they came in the late afternoon, when the light was going and the ranch hands were beginning to wind down, and they stayed for maybe 20 minutes before something called them back inside. She thought it was probably a woman from town named Mrs. Alcott, who came in the afternoons to mind them, based on the battered wagon she'd seen twice in the yard. The woman never came to the barn. On the 12th day, the girl came around the side of the barn instead of staying at the window. She was small for 8, with dark hair cut bluntly at her jaw, and her father's eyes that same quality of watchfulness, that same careful measuring. She was wearing a coat that was slightly too large for her. The sleeves rolled back, and she stood about 10 feet from the barn door with her hands in her pockets, like she was trying to look like she'd just happened to be passing by. Evelyn was rehanging a broken stall latch. She didn't stop working. "You can come in if you want," she said, "or you can stand out there. Either one's fine." A pause. Then the girl came 3 steps closer. "Are you fixing the latch?" "Trying to. It's stripped. I'm going to have to set it a little higher than it was, so the wood catches." Clara came another 2 steps. She had the cautious approach of an animal that has been startled enough times that it now treats all new things with preliminary suspicion. "Daddy said we're not supposed to come to the barn when the hands are working. He's said you're not supposed to be underfoot," said a voice from around the corner. And then Samuel appeared too, which told Evelyn the boy had been there the whole time and had sent his sister in first to test the water. He was the same height as Clara, same dark hair, but he held himself differently, a little more forward, a little more ready to run either towards something or away from it. "That's a reasonable rule," Evelyn said. She pushed the latch pin into the new position, tested it. Stall's door swung and latched clean. She straightened, turned to face them fully for the first time. "Are you underfoot?" They both looked at their feet, as if checking. Samuel said, "No, then I think you're probably all right." She went to the next task, which was checking the water situation in the east stalls, and she didn't say anything else and didn't look back at them. After about 30 seconds, she heard 2 sets of small boots come through the barn door. They stayed for an hour. They didn't get in the way. Samuel asked questions with the relentless specificity of a child who has decided he wants to understand a thing completely. How did she know when a horse was sick? What did the different sounds mean? Why did that one keep pawing the ground? Clara asked almost nothing, but watched everything with an intensity that Evelyn recognized as the same thing in a different shape. The girl was cataloging, taking notes that wouldn't be written down anywhere. When the light was almost gone, Evelyn said, "You should head back before Mrs. Alcott notices you're gone," Clara said. "She won't notice. Sleeps in the chair. Still." Samuel said, "Will you be here tomorrow?" "I live in the loft," Evelyn said. So yes, he considered this. You live in the barn? For now. He looked up at the loft, then back at her, working something through. Isn't it cold? I've got a good stove. Oh, he seemed unsatisfied with this answer, but couldn't identify exactly why. Okay. They went back to the house. Evelyn climbed to the loft and ate the biscuit she'd saved from supper, and thought about those two small faces and tried very hard not to attach anything to them yet. She was new here. She was provisional. The worst thing she could do for herself, for them, was to let something take hold before she knew whether the ground beneath it was solid. She didn't entirely succeed, but she tried. Cole noticed that the children had been to the barn on the 13th day, when Samuel made the mistake of mentioning at supper that the gray horse was named Jasper and that he'd had colic before, but that Evelyn had walked him out of it in the dark, and that colic could kill a horse faster than most people thought. Cole sat with this information for a moment, then looked at his son with the expression of a man who is choosing his words the way you choose footing on icy ground. You went to the barn, he said. Samuel looked at his plate. She said we weren't underfoot. Samuel. She did say that, Clara offered, which was not strategically helpful, but was accurate. Cole set down his fork. He sat with it for another moment. Then he said, Mrs. Hartwell is a ranch hand. She's here to work, not to mind children. She wasn't minding us, Samuel said. We were watching her work. There's a difference, Clara added. Cole looked at his daughter, then his son, then presumably at some point in the middle distance, where he was calculating how much energy this particular argument was worth. He picked his fork back up. You stay out of her way, he said. She's not here for you. Neither child said anything, which was not the same as agreeing, and Cole knew it, but there was only so far you could push a conversation at the supper table without it becoming something else. The next afternoon, Evelyn was working in the barn and heard footsteps she recognized as not belonging to any of the hands. She did not look up from what she was doing. He said, We can look from the door, Clara said, as long as we don't get underfoot. That's a reasonable compromise, Evelyn said. So they stood in the doorway. And then, gradually, over the next several days, the doorway became the inside of the barn, and the inside of the barn became wherever Evelyn happened to be working. And none of this was discussed or negotiated. It just happened, the way things happen when nobody makes a formal decision to prevent them. She was careful with them. She kept the warmth behind glass. The way you keep something precious that you're not sure yet is yours to hold. She answered their questions directly, without performing delight at how clever they were, and she didn't offer more than they asked for. Children always know when they're being managed. These two in particular had the radar of kids who'd been managing themselves for longer than they should have had to. Clara was the one who told her on a Tuesday afternoon, while watching Evelyn rebraid a frayed lead rope, that their mother used to smell like lavender soap and that Mrs. Alcott smelled like onions. That's a specific thing to notice, Evelyn said. I notice things, Clara said in a tone that suggested this was simply a fact about herself, like being right-handed. Evelyn tied off the end of the braid. What else do you notice? Clara thought about it, with the seriousness of someone taking an inventory. Daddy laughs less than he used to. Cass's knees hurt when it rains because of how he walks before it. And you hold something in your coat pocket sometimes when you think nobody's looking. So Evelyn went still for just a moment. Then she went back to the rope. You're right, she said. About all three. Clara seemed satisfied with this. She didn't ask what was in the pocket, which told Evelyn the girl understood that some things weren't hers to pursue. 8 years old, and she already understood that. It was a hard kind of understanding for a child to have. Kind you get from losing things. The trouble started in town. Evelyn had known it was coming. She wasn't naive about what she looked like from the outside, a widow with no land and no family, showing up at a bachelor rancher's property with a single bag and no references anyone could check. The frontier ran on reputation the way it ran on water, and she had none of the former and was trying to rebuild the latter from scratch. People would talk. People always talked. She'd learned in Cheyenne that the story a community tells about you has very little to do with who you actually are, and almost everything to do with what they need the story to be. The woman who started it was named Ruth Pierce. Evelyn had seen her twice in the dry goods store, a narrow woman in her mid-40s with expensive taste in cloth and the social authority that comes from being married to the man who owns the grain exchange. Ruth Pierce had the particular gift of people who traffic in reputation, the ability to phrase an attack as a concern. She came to the ranch on a Wednesday, which was when the hands drove the supply wagon into Grover's Flat, which meant most of the ranch population was temporarily somewhere else. Evelyn was alone in the barn. Ruth Pierce did not come to the barn. She went to the house, where Cole apparently received her with the wariness of a man who knows a social call from someone like Ruth Pierce is never actually social. Evelyn didn't know what was said in that house. She learned the general shape of it later from Denny, who had stayed back that day with a pulled muscle and had been in the bunkhouse close enough to the main house to catch fragments through walls. What Ruth Pierce apparently said, with a great deal of gentle concern, was that people in town were worried about Cole having a woman of unknown character living on his property around his children, without anyone knowing anything about her real history or her real intentions. And that, as a friend, she stressed the word. She felt she owed it to him to mention it. What Cole apparently said was something brief and not particularly polite, and Ruth Pierce had left shortly after. But the thing about a concern, voiced out loud, is that it doesn't go back where it came from, just because the person you said it to wasn't interested. It goes sideways. It finds other ears. And within a week, Evelyn could feel the change in how people looked at her on the 2 occasions she went into town for supplies. The looking away that is not casual but deliberate, conversations that lower half a register when you walk in. She had lived through this before, in a different configuration, after Thomas died, and Harold started his campaign. She knew the mechanics of it, the way a community contracts around a story, and how once you're on the wrong side of that contraction, almost nothing you do looks innocent anymore. She went back the ranch and worked harder. She didn't know what else to do. She was not a woman who was good at defending herself with words. She was good at work, and she put her energy where it would actually change something. Cass found her splitting wood behind the barn one evening, working through a cord she'd decided needed to be gotten through before the real cold came. He stood and watched her for a while with his coffee, which was his way of indicating he wanted to talk, but wasn't sure yet if the timing was right. She set them all down. "Say it," she said. "Ruth Pierce is telling people you're after his money." Evelyn looked at him, then she picked up the maul and split another log. "Did she say anything else?" "That you showed up with nothing. That women who show up with nothing have reasons." "Women who show up with nothing usually had everything taken from them," Evelyn said. "That's a less interesting story." Cass drank his coffee. "You want me to say something?" "To who?" "Town." "Pierce." Whoever. What would you say?" He thought about it. "That you saved Jasper. That you work harder than men half your age. That you haven't once gone near the house except that one time when." He stopped. She looked at him. "When what?" "When the kids were crying, and Mrs. Alcott wasn't waking up for it." He said it carefully, watching her face. "Denny told me. He was up late, and he heard it. Said you stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a long time before you went in. She hadn't known she'd been seen. She'd thought everyone was asleep. I shouldn't have gone in," she said. He made the rule clear. "You want to tell me you would have stood there and listened to those 2 children cry themselves sick?" She didn't answer that. "No," Cass said. "You wouldn't. You didn't." He finished his coffee and set the cup on the fence post. "Talked to some people in town. Not about you directly. Just about what I've seen." She split another log. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, and moved on because she was not comfortable with gratitude any more than she was comfortable with pity, and they lived close enough together that she had trouble telling them apart. What Cass hadn't told her, because he hadn't known, was that Cole had also heard about the night in question, not from Denny, from Clara, who mentioned it at breakfast 3 weeks later in the offhand way. Children mention things they assume are already known the night misses. Hartwell came in when Samuel was sick and then stopped when she registered her father's face. Cole didn't come to the barn that day. He didn't come the next day either. On the third day, Evelyn was in the far stall working with the bay mare, who had finally decided to accept her, but was still skittish about being touched on the left side, behind the shoulder. She was working through it slowly, 1 inch at a time, keeping her hand flat and her movement predictable when she heard Cole come into the barn. He stood in the aisle and waited. She came out when she'd gotten to a stopping point that wouldn't undo the last 20 minutes of patience at Zionos. He looked at her with the expression she was coming to recognize as his version of uncertain, which on his face was almost indistinguishable from anger, just a shuttered, compressed quality, the look of a man holding more than one thing at once and not sure what to do with any of it. "Clara told me," he said. "Evelyn didn't pretend she didn't know what he meant. I know I crossed the line. I won't." "Samuel had a fever," he said. "He gets them. High ones, fast." He stopped. Tried again. "Mrs. Alcott sleeps deeply. He stopped again. "Clara can't always wake her." Evelyn waited. "What did you do for him?" he said. And it came out as a statement rather than a question, because he wasn't sure he wanted the answer, but needed it anyway. "Cool cloth. Got his temperature down. Sat with him until he was sleeping right." She paused. "I've managed fevers before." Something moved across Cole Blackthorn's face that he immediately closed down, like a window being shuttered against a storm. She'd seen it, the naked gratitude and the grief underneath it, and the particular anguish of a man who has been trying so hard to be enough for 2 children who need more than one person can give, and who knows it, and cannot figure out what to do about that knowledge. "My rule stands," he said. "I know, but if it happens again..." He stopped, set his jaw, started over. "If it happens again and you hear it, you come get me first, before anything else. Your room's on the other side of the house. Then you knock loud enough to wake me." She looked at him. He looked back. There was something in the exchange that was not quite the conversation they were having, something larger, with more weight to it, that neither of them was ready to hold yet. "All right," she said. He nodded, turned to go. Then at the barn door, he stopped without turning around. "She hadn't washed his face," he said. "When Clara told me," she said, Mrs. Hartwell, "washed his face first thing because he didn't like feeling hot and dirty at the same time." He went out. Evelyn stood in the aisle of the barn for a moment, very still. She's back to the mare. Storm that had been building in the northwest for 3 days came on a Thursday night in late November. Announced first by the way the horses got restless and communicative in the way that animals are always ahead of the weather, and then by the wind picking up around supper time, and then by the temperature dropping so fast that the water in the troughs had a skin of ice by the time it was full dark. Evelyn stayed in the barn. She wasn't going to leave the horses in that she'd seen what bad storms could do when animals panicked and started throwing themselves against stall doors, and the bay mare was already showing signs of building toward something. She moved through the stalls, settled each horse in turn, checked the stove in the loft, and banked it high, made sure the barn doors were braced from the inside. She was doing her second round of the stalls when she heard it above the wind. Sound from the house. Not the kind she could identify easily from this distance, in this wind, just a high frequency that didn't belong with the storm. She stood still in the barn and listened, and the wind shifted, and she heard it clearly for 2 seconds. A child screaming. Not crying, screaming. She was through the barn door and across the yard in the dark before she'd made any conscious decision about it. The wind hit her like a wall, bitter and wet with the first needles of sleet, the kind of cold that gets into your collar and down your neck and doesn't let go. She made the porch in a run, took the steps at once, hit the front door. It was unlocked. She went through the front room and followed the sound which was coming from the back of the house, from the direction of the room she'd identified as the children's based on the placement of the small window. The hallway was dark. She felt along the wall. Clara was in the doorway of the bedroom with a candle in her hand, and her face in the candlelight was the face of a child who has been holding herself together through pure will for longer than any child should have to. Samuel was in the bed, and even in the dim light, Evelyn could see that his fever was bad, the way he was turned and the sound he was making. That thin, keening quality that was different from ordinary distress, that indicated the body reaching its upper limit. How long? Evelyn said. I don't know. An hour. Mrs. Alcott won't? I couldn't? Go get your father. His room now. Knock until he comes. Clara went. Evelyn went to the bed. She stripped the blanket back, which was wrong he'd been piled under it, which was the instinct but not the remedy. She found the basin on the dresser, found the pitcher, poured water over her hands to check the temperature cold enough, and got the cloth wet. She talked to him while she worked. Not loud, not fast, not with the false cheerfulness of someone performing calm. Just steady, ordinary words in a low register. I'm here. I've got you. You're going to be okay. The same intention she used with the horses, the same essentials message. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Breathe. She heard Cole in the hallway before he came through the door, the particular sound of a man moving fast in a house he knows in the dark. He came through the doorway in his shirt and trousers, no boots, his hair wrong from sleep, and he took in the scene in a single sweep and came to the other side of the bed. How bad, he said. Bad, not the worst. She kept working. He needs the fever broken. Do you have willow bark or kitchen? Top shelf. Left of the stove, tin labeled with a B. Get it, he went. She kept working. Clara appeared in the doorway again, and Evelyn said, Come hold the candle close for me. And Clara came without hesitation and held the candle steady with a concentration that was almost heartbreaking. The way she had clearly decided to be useful, because useful was the only thing available to her. Cole came back with the tin. She had him measure the dose she told him to. She didn't trust herself to do it and keep monitoring the child's breathing at the same time, and she got it into Samuel between shallow breaths and went back to the cool cloth, working it across his forehead and throat and the inside of his wrists where the pulse ran close to the surface. Has he had seizures before? She said. Cole's face tightened. Once 2 years ago. What did the fever get to? The doctor said it was too high. He didn't. He stopped. He wrote it down somewhere. If he starts to shake, we turn him on his side. You hold him steady, and I work the cloth. She looked up at Cole across the bed. He's not there yet, but I want you to know the plan. Cole nodded. He was holding Samuel's hand, which she wasn't sure he'd noticed himself doing. She noticed because it was the kind of thing that registered the automatic gesture of a father's hand, finding his child's in the dark. The fever broke 40 minutes later. It went the way fevers break, not all at once, but gradually, like a tide going out, the heat releasing and the sweat coming, and the child's breathing losing that tight, labored quality and becoming something closer to normal. Samuel surfaced briefly, eyes halfway open, unfocused, and said something none of them caught, and Cole leaned in close and said, I'm here. I'm right here, son. And Samuel went back under into what was clearly regular sleep. Not the fever sleep, the real kind. Evelyn sat back. Her knees ached from kneeling on the floorboards. She became aware, suddenly, of the storm outside, still going, the wind against the windows and the sound of sleet hitting the glass. Cole sat on the edge of the bed. He had not let go of his son's hand. Clara was sitting in the chair in the corner, with the candle still upright in both hands, watching her brother sleep. She looked exhausted in the specific way of children who have been scared for a long time and are now on the other side of it and don't quite know how to let the scared go. Come here, Evelyn said, and held out her arm. Clara came. She sat against Evelyn's side, and Evelyn put her arm around her, and they sat like that in the chair. The girl and the woman she barely knew, while the storm worked at the windows and the fever slowly went the rest of the way out of the room. After a while, Clara said in a very small voice, I was scared. I know, Evelyn said. I didn't know what to do. You knew to get your father. You knew to keep the candle lit. Evelyn looked at the top of the girl's dark head. You did everything right. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, are you going to stay? The question was layered in ways a child probably didn't intend but couldn't help. Evelyn felt all the layers of it. Tonight, yes, she said. Clara didn't push for more than that. Maybe she understood there wasn't more available yet. She tucked her chin down and within 10 minutes was asleep against Evelyn's shoulder, still holding the candle, which had burned down far enough that Evelyn gently took it from her fingers and set it on the dresser where it could finish burning without danger. Cole looked up from the bed. In the candlelight, his face was different than she'd seen it before. Still guarded, still closed in the ways it had been closed since the first night she'd stood in his barn doorway. But something underneath the guard was visible. Briefly, the exhaustion of a man who has been trying to hold too much alone for too long, and the thing that lives just below exhaustion, which is the desperate wish not to have to. He looked at his son asleep, then at his daughter asleep against the shoulder of a woman he'd hired to clean stalls and told to stay away from his house. He didn't say anything. She didn't expect him to. Outside, the storm pressed against the glass, and the wind came under the door with its cold edge, and inside the lamp was low, and both children were breathing steady and quiet. And the woman who had arrived at this ranch 2 weeks ago with a single bag and $7.40 and a square of folded cloth sat in the chair and watched over the two small people who had somehow, without anyone planning it, decided to let her in. She did not let herself name what she was feeling. It was too new and too fragile, and the ground it was standing on was not proven yet. But she sat there through the long back end of the storm, and she did not move. And she kept her arm around Clara until the first gray light came through the window, and somewhere between the dark and the dawn, Cole Blackthorn pulled the chair from the corner over to the other side of the bed and sat down in it and fell asleep, still holding his son's hand. She watched him sleep for a moment, the hard face gone, soft, the way faces only go when the person inside them stops working at things, and then she looked away because that felt like something she hadn't been given permission to see. She looked at Samuel instead, at the small rise and fall of his chest under the quilt, steady now and regular as a clock. She looked at Clara's dark hair against her shoulder. She listened to the storm working itself out, the wind dropping degrees by degrees as the night gave way, the sleet turning to the quieter sound of snow. When the light was strong enough to see, she eased Clara down onto the foot of the bed and stood up carefully, working the stiffness out of her knees. She looked at the room, the three of them asleep. The candle burned down to a nub, the basin of cool water still sitting beside the bed. She picked up her coat from the chair back where she'd dropped it the night before. She went back to the barn. The horses needed feeding. The stoves needed checking. The work was there and it was hers, and she did it. But something had changed in the way the morning sat around her. Something too quiet and too full at the same time. She moved through the familiar tasks of the barn with the feeling of a person who has been handed something she wasn't expecting and is not yet sure she has the right to keep. Cole didn't mention the night for 3 days. Evelyn didn't expect him to. She understood by now how he operated. He needed time to put things in order before he could speak about them, the way some men need to see a thing from every angle before they'll admit it's real. She'd been married long enough to recognize the type. Thomas had been the same way, sitting with something for days before bringing it out, and by the time he finally said a thing, it was usually more considered and more honest than what most men said in the heat of the moment. She didn't know yet if Cole Blackthorn had that quality too, or if he was just a man who preferred silence to accountability. She was still learning which things about him were character and which were habit. What she did notice in those 3 days was that the rule about the house had quietly changed shape, not eliminated, not spoken about, just adjusted, the way a fence line gets moved a few posts over without anyone making a formal announcement about it. Mrs. Alcott stopped coming in the afternoons. Evelyn didn't ask why. She simply noticed that the battered wagon was no longer in the yard, and that, around the time it would have arrived, Clara started appearing at the barn door instead, with Samuel usually 2 steps behind her, wearing that expression of his that was trying to be casual and not quite managing it. Cole began leaving the kitchen door unlatched in the evenings. He didn't tell her about this either. She discovered it on the 5th day after the fever night, when she came across the yard with a question about feed supply and found the door standing open half an inch in the cold, which was not an accident in November in Wyoming. A man who had built and managed a working ranch for over a decade did not leave doors open by accident in November. She went through it. She knocked on the interior door frame out of courtesy before she did. Cole was at the kitchen table with a ledger, and he looked up at her with the expression of a man who was prepared for this and was going to pretend he wasn't. "Feed question," she said. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He closed the ledger and turned it over, the way men turn things over when they want to signal a subject change. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "I owe you an apology," he said. Evelyn waited. "Not for the rule. The rule was reasonable." He said this like he'd rehearsed it, which he probably had. "But the way I said it, the manner of it." He stopped, tried a different start. "You've been here 6 weeks, and what you've put into this place is more than most hands give in a year. And I've treated you like someone I was waiting to catch, doing something wrong. You had reasons," she said. "They weren't good enough." He said it flatly, like a conclusion reached by calculation rather than feeling, which she suspected was exactly what it was. Cole Blackthorn did not seem to be a man who arrived at emotional honesty through sentiment. He arrived there through logic, through adding things up until the sum was undeniable. "Clara told me you held her until she fell asleep. She told me you took the candle from her so she wouldn't drop it." He looked at the table. "Doesn't let most people touch her. She hasn't since her mother." The air in the kitchen was close and warm and smelled like the coffee that was still on the stove. Evelyn sat with what he'd said and didn't fill the space with anything, because it didn't need filling. "Samuels asked me this morning if you could eat supper with us," Cole said. "Friday." "I don't need to do that," she said quickly. "No." "But," he asked. He looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. "I'm asking. On behalf of him, but asking." She looked at this man across the kitchen table, this closed, weathered, careful man who was doing his level best to say something true, and finding the architecture of it unfamiliar. She thought about the lock of hair in her coat pocket. She thought about what it had cost her to sit in the chair that night, to let herself be present in someone else's grief-shaped house, to feel the weight of a sleeping child against her shoulder and not let that weight undo her. "Friday's fine," she said. He nodded. "Open the ledger again." "Feed question," she asked it. He answered it. She went back to the barn. Neither of them mentioned the rest of it, which was a bigger conversation than either of them was ready for. And they both knew it, and neither of them was going to pretend otherwise. The supper on Friday was awkward in the specific way of people trying not to be awkward, which is always worse than ordinary awkward. Samuel talked too much, overcompensating for the unusual situation, with a running commentary on everything, from the condition of the fence in the north pasture to a detailed account of a rabbit he had seen that afternoon that he believed was the same rabbit he'd seen in August based on the marking on its left ear. Clara said almost nothing and watched everything, as was her nature. Cole asked Evelyn 2 questions about the horses and answered one of her questions about the property's water sources. And they ate Margaret Alcott's leftover stew because Mrs. Alcott, it turned out, still came in the mornings to cook and clean and had simply been quietly replaced in the afternoon portion of her duties by a woman who hadn't formally agreed to take them on. After supper, Samuels said, "Can you show me again how you do the thing with your hand when the horse doesn't want to be touched?" "Dark," Cole said. "The barn has a lamp." Cole looked at Evelyn. "Not a long lesson," she said. They went to the barn, all 4 of them, which was not what anyone had planned, but was what happened. She showed Samuel the flat hand approach with the bay mare, who was tolerating being touched on the left shoulder now, and was even beginning to lean into it slightly, which was a victory she hadn't announced to anyone, because she'd learned that announcing small victories jinxed them. Samuel tried it with the focus of a child who takes instruction seriously. Clara stood back and watched, and then, without prompting, held out her own hand flat to the mare's nose, and the mare snuffled at it. And Clara made a sound Evelyn hadn't heard her make before, a short, delighted, unguarded sound that was simply surprise at being accepted. Cole stood near the barn door with his hands in his coat pockets and said nothing. Stayed. That was December. January came in hard, the way January in Wyoming always came, without apology and with the clear intention of staying longer than welcome. The temperature dropped far enough that the water in the barn troughs needed breaking every morning with the back of the feed scoop, and Evelyn's breath came out in clouds that didn't disperse quickly in the still, frozen air. She added a second blanket to the loft and banked the stove higher and wore her coat inside for the first 2 hours of every morning, until her body heat and the stove between them made the barn warm enough to work in properly. She took her suppers at the house on Fridays now, and then twice a week, and then most evenings. And this gradual shift happened so naturally that she couldn't have identified the day it became the norm rather than the exception. Cole set an extra place at the table without discussion. Samuels had apparently decided she was a permanent fixture and treated her accordingly, which meant assigning her opinions on things and referencing conversations from weeks ago, as if she would obviously remember them, which she did. Clara remained watchful, but had begun, incrementally, to offer things a comment, a small observation, once a drawing she'd made of the bay mare, that she placed on the barn ledge without comment and without looking at Evelyn, which was an 8-year-old's version of a gift. It was Cass who first told her that the talk in town had gotten worse. He did it directly, which she appreciated. He came to find her in the barn on a Wednesday morning in the second week of January and stood with his hat in his hands, which was how she knew it was serious, because Cass never took his hat off indoors, and said, "Ruth Pierce is telling people you've moved yourself into the house." Evelyn set down what she was doing. "I have supper there." "She's not describing it as supper." Evelyn looked at him. "She's saying you've positioned yourself to get your hands on the ranch, that you've used the children to get close enough." He was watching her face as he said it, not with suspicion, but with the careful attention of someone who is delivering news and wants to see honestly how it lands. She brought it to the Reverend, and he brought it to 3 families, and now it's the kind of thing that has a shape in people's minds before anyone's checked if it's true. Evelynson sat with this for a moment. The barn was quiet around them, the horses shifting in their stalls, the sound of wind at the roof. "What does Cole know?" she said. He heard some version. "Denny says he went into town yesterday, and there was a conversation at the grain exchange that didn't go easy. Cass turned his hat. He didn't fire you. He came back and went straight to the house and didn't say much to anyone." She understood that. Cole processing. Cole adding things up. What she hadn't expected was the knock at the barn door that evening. After supper, after she'd come back from the house and climbed to the loft and was sitting with her boots off and her back against the hay bale, not sleeping, just sitting with the weight of it. The knock was low on the barn door, below adult height, and she knew before she climbed down who it was. Clara was standing in the dark outside the barn door, in her coat over her nightgown, boots unlaced, her breath coming in visible clouds. She was holding something, a piece of paper. "You should be in bed," Evelyn said. "I heard Daddy talking to Cass," Clara said. "After supper. I wasn't listening on purpose. The kitchen isn't very big." Evelyn stepped back to let her in out of the wind. The girl came in, looked around the barn, the way she always did, first checking the horses, inventory, and then held out the paper. It was the drawing, not the mare one. A new one, done in the dark, judging by the slightly uncertain lines, showing 2 figures that were recognizably meant to be herself and Clara sitting in the chair from Samuel's room. Candle on the dresser was there. Samuel's shape in the bed. "I made it so you could have it," Clara said. "In case you left." Evelyn looked at the drawing. She kept her face still, which required more effort than she would have liked to admit. "I'm not planning on leaving," she said. Mrs. Alcott said that once. The one before her said it too. Clara said this without bitterness, just with the flat accuracy of someone reporting conditions. "People say things, they do," Evelyn agreed. She looked at the girl. "I'm not going to tell you I'll never leave, because I can't see the future and I won't lie to you. But I'll tell you I don't have anywhere else to go that means anything to me, and that counts for something." Clara considered this. "Counts for a medium amount," she said finally. "Fair," Evelyn said. She walked Clara back to the house, made her go in through the kitchen door, watched until the light in the upstairs window went on. Then she stood in the yard for a moment. In the cold, the drawing folded inside her coat against the flour sack cloth, and she looked up at the sky, which was clear, in the way January nights are clear mercilessly, brilliantly, without warmth. She had told the girl the truth. She didn't have anywhere else that meant anything. She went back to the barn and didn't sleep well, and in the morning she got up before light and worked, which was also normal. And she decided that what Ruth Pierce said about her was Ruth Pierce's problem and not hers, which was the decision she always came to and which never made it entirely easier. The situation changed, and changed badly, on a Saturday in late January. She was in the barn when she heard the wagon come into the yard. She didn't think much of it. Wagons came and went. But then she heard the voice, and the voice was not one she recognized from Grover's flat. It was a man's voice, loud and self-assured in the way of men who are accustomed to their volume-settling arguments before the argument starts. She couldn't hear the words, only the shape of the conversation. Cole's voice, lower and tighter than usual, and this other voice talking over it with a confidence that was designed to feel like authority. Cass appeared at the barn door. "You should probably stay in here for now," he said, which was his way of telling her she absolutely needed to know what was happening, but he wasn't sure she should be part of it yet. "Who is it?" she said. "Man named Garrett Hollis. He's got a piece of paper with him and a county seal on it. Put down the brush." "What kind of paper?" Cass looked at her with the expression of a man who has learned that delivering bad news clearly is more useful than softening it. "Kind that makes inquiries about the welfare of minor children on the property." He paused. "Ruth Pierce's husband owns the grain exchange. The county magistrate owes the grain exchange money." She understood the architecture of it immediately. She'd seen it before. This was how Harold had done it too. Not through direct confrontation, but through institutional leverage, through the careful application of money and connection to make the machinery move in the direction you wanted it to move. It was the most efficient kind of cruelty because it came dressed as process. "Does it say," she said, "the paper, that there are concerns about the stability of the household, given the presence of an unattached woman of unclear character, and that an inquiry has been opened to determine whether the children's welfare is being adequately maintained?" Cass said it like he'd memorized it, which he probably had. "Hollis has the authority to remove them temporarily to a suitable family placement while the inquiry runs." Cold came into the barn then, or maybe it had been there all along, and she was only feeling it now. She stood very still. "Does Cole know the connection to Pierce?" she said. "He's figuring it out." "How long does an inquiry take?" "Weeks, maybe months. Hollis has discretion." She looked at the barn door. She could see the edge of the yard, the back of the unfamiliar wagon, the corner of the house. She could not see Cole or the man with the paper. "Cass," she said. "Yeah." "Go back out there." He went. She stood in the barn for 3 minutes, which was what she allowed herself, 3 minutes, to feel the particular cold fury of being used as the instrument of something that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the cruelty of people with money and small imaginations. 3 minutes of that, and then she filed it somewhere below, working depth, and started thinking clearly. She thought about what she knew. She knew that a county inquiry needed grounds, and that the grounds here were fabricated, assembled by a woman with a grudge and executed by a magistrate with a debt. She knew that fabricated grounds depended on a version of events. and that versions of events could be countered by other versions of events, specifically by witnesses who had actually been present for the actual events. She knew that Cass had been on this ranch for 11 years and Denny for 2, and both of them had seen exactly what had happened between herself and the Blackthorn household. She also thought about what she didn't know. She didn't know what Cole was going to do with this. She didn't know if, faced with the pressure of an official inquiry and the implicit suggestion that she was the source of the problem, he would decide the simplest solution was the most obvious one. She had been here before, not exactly here, but close enough to recognize the shape of it, the moment when you become the easiest thing for someone else to let go of. She picked up the brush and went back to the mare, because the mare needed finishing, and standing still doing nothing was not going to change what was happening in the yard. She worked through it methodically, stroke by stroke, and kept her mind on the task and off the sound of raised voices that drifted to her in pieces on the cold air. She heard the wagon leave 40 minutes later. Cole came to the barn 20 minutes after that, came in without knocking, which was technically his barn, and stood in the aisle with his coat still on, still holding his hat, which meant he'd come straight from the yard and hadn't stopped at the house. His jaw was set in the way she'd learned meant he was holding something under pressure. He's gone for now, Cole said. He'll be back in 2 weeks with a formal assessment date. Are the children inside? They don't know what it was about. He looked at her steadily, yet she waited. Tell me what you want to do, he said. Question surprised her. She hadn't expected to be asked. She'd expected to be told that she should leave quietly, told that her presence was making things complicated, told the version of this where she was the problem, and the solution was her absence. She'd been building herself up to hear it and had been deciding on the way she was going to respond to it, which was with as much dignity as she could hold together. Instead, he was asking what she wanted. She had to rethink, quickly, what kind of man she was actually dealing with. I want to stay, she said, not for my sake, for theirs. She met his eyes. I know what that inquiry is. I know where it came from, and I know that if you send me away, it solves nothing. Pierce gets what she wants, and she'll find another way to use it against you next time. Cole was quiet. The witnesses are here, she said. Cass, Denny, the others. They've seen exactly what I've done on this property, and what I haven't done. An inquiry built on rumor falls apart when it meets the actual record. She paused. If you let me stay and we answer it straight, it collapses. If you send me away, it looks like evidence. Cole turned his hat in his hands. He looked at the horse she'd been working, the bay mare, who had come to the stall door with the curiosity of an animal who has decided a person is worth watching. There's a storm coming, he said. She blinked at the apparent change of subject. I know. The horses have been, not a metaphor, he said, an actual storm. Hollis mentioned it on the way out, ironically. Said the road would be impassable for assessors by the end of the week. He was still looking at the mare, which means we have approximately 10 days. To do what? To make a record. He finally looked at her. I have a lawyer in Laramie who owes me a conversation. I need to get to him before the storm closes the road. She looked at him. You were already planning this. I was planning something. I hadn't decided if it included you staying. He said it directly, not unkindly. I've decided. She nodded. She wasn't going to make more of it than it was. He was a practical man making a practical decision, and the fact that it aligned with what she needed didn't require decoration. When do you go to Laramie? She said. Tomorrow morning. I'll be back before the storm. He put his hat on. The children are going to need to be told something. Not everything, but something. He paused at the stall. I'd like you to be there when I do it. She looked at him. He appeared to consider this genuinely, the way he considered things from the outside in. Because Clara will take it better if you're there. And Samuel will have questions I don't know how to answer. And it was honest. It was also more than she'd expected him to give, and she thought this was what he was like when he stopped defending. Not warm, exactly, but real in a way that warmth sometimes wasn't. All right, she said. He left. She stood in the barn for a moment, alone with the horses and the sound of wind building at the roof, and she thought about what was coming: the inquiry, the lawyer, the storm, the 10 days between here and whatever came next, and she felt, beneath the weight of all of it, something that was not exactly calm, but was adjacent to it. Feeling of a person who has decided not to run. She'd made that decision before, and it had cost her everything. She was making it again, in a different place, for different reasons, and she didn't know yet what it was going to cost her this time. She went back to the mare. Cole left for Laramie at first light the following day. He told the children at breakfast that he had a business matter to attend to, which was the true part of a larger truth, and that Evelyn would be around, and Cass was in charge of the ranch operation, and he'd be back before the weather changed. Samuel asked if he could come. Cole said no. Samuel accepted this with the resignation of a child who has learned that certain requests are automatically declined and has stopped investing energy in appealing them. Clara looked at Evelyn across the breakfast table. Evelyn gave a small nod, which was not a promise of anything specific, but was the general shape of "I'm here." Clara looked back at her plate. She ate her eggs. The 4 days Cole was gone were quiet in the specific way of days when you're waiting for something and know it but are trying not to know it. Evelyn worked. She worked longer hours than usual because there was more to do. Cole handled the business side of the operation in the mornings, correspondence and record keeping, and the various administrative tasks of running a property this size, and in his absence, some of those things needed attention. She wasn't trained for that kind of work, but she could read and she could count, and Cass walked her through the pieces that needed immediate management. She also, for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Ranch, went through the property records that Cole kept in the study. She did this with Cass's knowledge. She wasn't looking for anything personal. She was looking for documentation. Dates of her hire, any written communication about her role, anything that established her presence on the property in formal terms rather than just informal arrangement. There wasn't much. Cole hadn't been expecting to need a paper trail for something as ordinary as hiring a barn worker. She added what she could. She wrote out, in her careful hand, the record of every significant task she'd performed since arriving, the horses she'd treated, the dates, what the conditions were, and what she'd done. The night of Samuel's fever, the dates she'd taken supper at the house, the dates the children had visited the barn. She wrote it in plain language, not the language of argument or defense, just the language of a daily record. She'd kept enough farm records over the years to know how they read and how to make them read clearly. She left the pages on the study desk for Cole to find. He came back on the 4th day, mid-afternoon, ahead of the weather. By maybe 6 hours, she could tell by the way he pushed the horse that he'd been watching the sky on the road. Back, he was cold and tired and didn't say much at supper, but he found her in the barn afterward and told her the lawyer's name was Fenwick, no relation to Harold. Though the name still landed in her chest, with a small impact she chose not to show, and that Fenwick was willing to submit a formal character at a station and to contest the grounds of the inquiry. He needs the record, Cole said. It's on the desk, she said. He looked at her. I wrote it out, she said. The last 6 weeks. Dates, specifics, what was done and why, she paused. If I've overstepped. You haven't, he said. He said it so quickly. It was almost sharp, and she understood from the quickness that he was also tired, and that tired people let things out they'd otherwise hold. It's exactly what Fenwick asked for. She nodded. He stood at the stall door, the same door he'd stood at before Jasper's stall, always the one he defaulted to when he was thinking. The horse put his nose over the door, and Cole rubbed it absent-mindedly, the gesture so habitual it was invisible to him. There's something you should know, he said, about why Pierce is doing this. He said it with the careful precision of a man who has decided something on the road and is going to say it before he talks himself out of it. She wanted the ranch. Before I bought it, she and her husband made an offer to the previous owner. I made a better one. He paused. She's never forgiven me for it. She's used different angles over the years. This is a new one. Evelyn looked at him. She's using me as an angle. Yes. He met her eyes, and I should have told you that earlier. Should have. When she first started with the talk, I should have explained the context. He looked at the horse, was hoping it would come to nothing. It rarely comes to nothing, she said. No, he agreed. It rarely does. The storm arrived that night, which was earlier than expected and angrier, the kind of December storm that doesn't announce itself properly, but simply appears with its full force at once: wind, snow, dropping temperature, the whole catalog. Evelyn woke to the sound of the barn roof, working under the load, and was out of the loft and checking the horses before she was fully awake, moving on the automatic competence she'd come to rely on in the middle of the night versions of herself. The bay mare was badly spooked, not just nervous, the full thing, wall-eyed and throwing her head, hitting the stall boards with the unpredictability of a large frightened animal in a small space. Evelyn got in there with her, which she knew was the higher risk option and was also the only one that was going to work, and she spent 40 minutes just surviving in the stall, with the horse not trying to control her, not trying to force calm, just being present and moving with it, until the mare's fear ran up against a consciousness that was steadier than her own and began grudgingly to take comfort from it. She was still in the stall, her back against the wall, the mare's nose in her shoulder, when the barn door opened. Cole came in from the storm with snow on his coat and the expression of a man who woke up and checked the weather and decided something needed looking after. He stopped at the stall. He took in the scene, Evelyn against the wall, the mare settled, the disheveled state of both woman and stall that told him the last 40 minutes had not been calm. How long, he said. Long enough, she said. She's all right now. He looked at the mare, who was indeed all right, still close to Evelyn, leaning into the shoulder contact, but breathing steady, and her eyes gone back to their normal expression. Then he looked at Evelyn, who was still sitting on the stall floor, because standing up quickly seemed inadvisable. He came around the stall door, which he hadn't done before, hadn't come into the stall while she was working, had always kept to the other side of the wall. He offered his hand. She took it. He helped her up. He didn't let go immediately, held it for a moment while she found her feet, and she was aware of the grip in the specific way. You're aware of something that's both ordinary and not ordinary at the same time. A hand taking your hand in a barn, in a storm, nothing more or less than that. Then he let go. The north fence has come down, he said. Between the storm and the inquiry, this is a difficult week. Yes, she said. The fence I can fix. He was looking at the mare, which was where he always looked when he was saying something real. The inquiry Fenwick believes we have a strong case. The records. With the witnesses. I believe it too, she said. Storm pressed at the barn from outside. The horses shifted in their stalls, restless and close to the edge. Single lamp threw its circle of light against the walls, and the dark was everything beyond it. Cole turned up his collar and went back out into the storm to check the fences, and Evelyn stayed in the barn and moved through the stalls. One more time, checking each horse in turn, hawking them down from the edge of panic, with the low, steady murmur that was not quite words. She was still doing this when, somewhere between the third and fourth stall, she realized that she was no longer thinking of this place as temporary. She had not noticed exactly when it had stopped temporary. She had been careful not to let it happen, had kept the glass between herself and what she felt, had made no promises, and accepted no certainties. But the glass was thinner now than it had been, and she could feel through it the warmth of what was on the other side, the children asleep in the house, the man somewhere in the storm, checking the fences of the property he'd built, the horses calm under her hands. The record she had written in her careful handwriting, sitting on the desk in the study, the drawing folded against the flour sack, cloth inside her coat. She pressed her hand flat to the bay mare's shoulder, and the mare leaned in. As outside, the storm worked at the walls. Inside, the lamp held its light. The storm left 3 feet of snow and a silence that felt earned. In the days that followed, the ranch moved through the aftermath, the way it moved through everything by working. The north fence got rebuilt in sections. Cole and Cass and Denny taking the frozen ground in shift because it fought back against the post digger with the stubbornness of earth that had no interest in being opened. The drifts against the barn's east wall had to be cleared before they turned to ice and put pressure on the boards. 2 of the older fence posts on the south line had snapped clean at the base, which meant a trip to the mill in Grover's Flat for lumber before the next cold front came down. Evelyn worked all of it alongside whoever needed another set of hands, without being asked and without making a point of it. That was the only way she knew how to exist in a place, by being useful to it, by letting the works speak rather than the words, which had always been unreliable instruments for her. What changed after the storm and after the night in the stall and after Cole's hand steadying hers in the dark was something in the quality of the space between them. It was not dramatic. It was not a conversation or a declaration or any of the things that get talked about afterward. It was simply that the guardedness that had characterized every exchange between them from the first night she'd stood in his barn doorway had shifted a degree or two toward something else. Not openness, exactly. More like the decision to stop working quite so hard at being closed. He began telling her things about the ranch that she hadn't asked about. Small operational things at first, where the property line ran in the northeast corner, where the water table was unreliable in dry years, which of the breeding mares had a history of difficult foalings. Kind of information you share with someone you expect to still be there next season. She took it in without remarking on what it meant, because remarking on it would have made it fragile, and they both seemed to understand that. Samuel noticed the change before Clara did, which surprised Evelyn because Clara was the observer of the two. Samuel was attuned to his father in a specific way that Clara was not less analytical, more instinctive. He came to the barn one afternoon with the transparent purpose of helping with a task he had no experience with. And after about 10 minutes of handing her things and being more hindrance than help, in the cheerful manner of children who don't realize it, he said, without looking at her, "Daddy smiled at breakfast." Evelyn kept working. "Is that unusual?" He smiles sometimes, but not at breakfast. Breakfast is usually just quiet. He handed her the wrong size wrench and she swapped it for the right one without comment. "You were there." "I was so." He considered the logic of this with the thoroughness of a child building a case. "I think it was because you were there." She looked at him. He was watching her with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of someone who has not yet learned that some observations are impolite to share aloud. "Maybe," she said. He seemed satisfied with this as an answer, which told her he hadn't really needed confirmation. He'd needed to say it to someone and see if the world kept turning afterward. It did. He went back to handing her things, including, this time, approximately the right wrench. The assessment date arrived on a Thursday in the second week of February. Garrett Hollis came with a woman named Patience Steed, who was apparently the county's designated assessor for child welfare inquiries, a square-built woman in her 50s, with the expression of someone who has seen a great many situations and is no longer impressed by any of them. Carried a leather case and a notebook, and she moved through the property with methodical thoroughness, looking at the house, the kitchen, the children's room, the barn, the yard. She asked questions in the direct, minimal way of someone who does this often, and has no patience for people who answer more than was asked. Evelyn answered what she was asked. She did not elaborate and did not defend. She had learned from Harold's proceedings that the instinct to justify yourself reads as guilt to people who are already suspicious, and that the most effective testimony is the kind that sounds like it doesn't know it's testimony. Hollis watched her throughout with an expression she couldn't read. He was not Ruth Pierce's ally. She had decided he was a bureaucratic instrument, and bureaucratic instruments followed momentum, which meant right now he was pointed in the direction. Pierce had aimed him, and his cooperation was a function of inertia rather than personal conviction. He shifted. Inertia responded to counter-pressure. The counter-pressure came from Cass. Evelyn hadn't asked Cass to prepare anything. She'd told him there would be an assessment and left it at that. Cass apparently decided to do with this information was spend the preceding week writing out 11 years of Blackthorn Ranch history in his slow, deliberate hand, covering every relevant event he'd witnessed with dates and specifics, in the language of a man who has never learned to soften things because he never saw the point of it. He handed it to patient Steed at the barn door on Thursday morning with the ceremony of someone serving a legal document. Steed read it. She read it for 6 minutes without looking up, which was longer than anything else she'd given her attention to that morning. "You've been here 11 years, she said to Cass. 12 in April, he said. And you've observed Mrs. Hartwell directly since her arrival in November. Every day, Cass said, she lives in the barn. Hard to miss her." Steed looked at the barn. She looked at Cass. She wrote something in her notebook. Denny gave his account with considerably less composure. He was nervous in the way of young men who feel the weight of official process and interpret it as personal threat, and he said some things in the wrong order and had to back up and correct himself twice. But the substance of what he said was solid, and Steed wrote it down with the same neutral efficiency she wrote everything. Cole gave his account last, in the study, with Hollis and Steed both present and Evelyn waiting in the kitchen, because she had not been asked to be in the room and understood that her absence was less complicated than her presence for this particular conversation. She could hear the voices, not the words. Cole's was even, which she'd learned to recognize as deliberate. He applied the same principle to difficult conversations that she applied to frightened horses, keeping the energy flat and the movement predictable. The meeting lasted an hour and 20 minutes. When Hollis and Steed came out of the study, Hollis had the look of a man who has traveled somewhere on someone else's directions and arrived to find the destination was not what was described, not angry, just recalibrated. He looked at Evelyn in the kitchen. "You kept records," he said. "I always keep records," she said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. He looked at her for another moment. Then he put on his hat. "We'll have a determination within 10 days, he said. "Formal inquiry will most likely be closed." He said the last part, with the careful phrasing of a man who cannot make promises but is as close to making one as his position allows. They left. Cole came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. He looked more tired than she'd seen him look, which was a specific kind of tired that comes not from physical work, but from sustained alertness, the exhaustion of having been careful for a long time. She put coffee in front of him without asking. He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Fenwick says Pierce overplayed her hand," he said. "If the inquiry closes without finding cause, it establishes a record that her claims were without foundation. If she tries again, that record works against her." "She'll try something else," Evelyn said. "Probably." He drank the coffee. "But not this. Not the children." He looked at the table. "I should have shut this down sooner, when it was still just talk in town before it became." He stopped. "You can't shut down talk in town," she said. "You can only let it run out of road." He looked at her. There was something in the look that she was getting better at reading the way he communicated things he hadn't yet found the words for, or had found them and wasn't sure yet whether he just trusted them outside his own head. She'd begun to learn the vocabulary of his silences, which was a different kind of intimacy than words, and in some ways a more honest one. "Clara wants to show you the new drawing," he said. "She's been working on it for a week, but she won't show it to me. She says it's not ready." "When it's ready," Evelyn said. He nodded. He finished the coffee and went back out to the fence work, because there was always fence work, and Evelyn washed the cups and thought about 10 days, and what came after, and what the word determination looked like when it arrived in writing. The determination arrived in 8, not 10. Hollis delivered it himself, which was not required, and told her something about the man that she filed away, that he had a conscience that was separate from whoever had set him in motion. The inquiry was closed. The grounds were found to be insufficient. There was language about the stability of the household and the demonstrated competence of the children's care arrangements, official language, which was official language. For we looked and what we found was not what we were told we'd find. Ruth Pierce's name appeared nowhere in the document. It didn't need to. Cole read it at the kitchen table with Clara and Samuel present. Because he had decided correctly, Evelyn thought that the children were old enough to know that something had been tried against their family and had not succeeded. He read the relevant sections aloud in plain language, translating the official phrasing as he went. And when he finished, Samuel said, "So we won?" Cole said, "The inquiry is closed." And Samuel said, "That's winning." And Clara said nothing, which was her version of profound agreement. Clara looked at Evelyn across the table. She looked at her for a long moment with that inventory expression, the one that cataloged everything. Then she got up from the table and went upstairs, and came back with the drawing that wasn't ready and put it on the table in front of Evelyn. It was the ranch, the barn, the house, the yard, the fence lines running out. And in the yard, small but distinct, 4 figures, 2 adults and 2 children, rendered in the careful, uncertain lines of an 8-year-old who has been working at something until it came out right. The proportions were imperfect. The barn was slightly too large. The sky was full of the kind of generous detail that children put into backgrounds when they love what they're drawing. Evelyn looked at it for a moment without speaking. "It's everyone," Samuel said, leaning over to see. "I can see that," Evelyn said. "You're the one on the left," Clara said. "The taller one. I thought I might be." Clara sat back down. She studied the table with the air of someone who has done a difficult thing and is not sure yet how it was received. Evelyn folded the drawing carefully, the same way she folded the flour sack cloth, and put it in her coat pocket. "Thank you," she said. Clara nodded once, quickly, and didn't make eye contact, which was how she accepted things that mattered to her. The trouble that came next was not Pierce. It came from a direction Evelyn hadn't been watching, which was the direction trouble usually came from. She had been so focused on the inquiry, on Hollis and Steed and Fenwick, and the 10 days that had become 8, that she hadn't been watching the grain exchange, hadn't been monitoring the conversations Cass reported from town, hadn't registered the significance of a man she'd seen twice in the yard in the weeks before the assessment, who was not one of the regular ranch hands, and who had never been properly introduced. His name, she learned later, was Dex Murrow. He worked for Gerald Pierce, Ruth's husband, in a capacity that Cass described as whatever needs doing that Pierce doesn't want his name on. He was a lean, quiet man with the kind of stillness that doesn't read as patience but as something colder, the stillness of someone who is waiting for the moment to be right rather than the moment to be pleasant. She found out about Murrow on a Saturday morning in late February when she came back from the south fence to find the barn empty of children, which was wrong. Because on Saturday mornings, Clara and Samuel had taken to spending the first hours in the barn with her as a matter of course. The habit had become solid enough that its absence registered immediately. She went to the house. Mrs. Alcott, who still came in the mornings and who had, to her credit, given her account to Patience Steed, without being asked and without embellishment, was in the kitchen, looking shaken in the way of a woman who is trying to maintain composure as a matter of dignity rather than genuine calm. They went with the man, Mrs. Alcott said. He said, "Mr. Blackthorn sent him. He had a note." Evelyn went cold and still. What note? With Mr. Blackthorn's name on it. Said there was a problem at the north pasture, and he'd sent Murrow to bring the children out to him. She stopped. "I thought it was they go with their father to the pasture. Sometimes. I didn't think." "Which way did they go?" Evelyn said. "North Road." But Mrs. Hartwell, she was already out the door. She found Cole at the east fence line where he had been all morning, and had sent no one to the house with any note. He heard her out in 3 sentences, and his face did something she'd never seen it do. Past the controlled compression of anger, and into something that had no name she could put to it. The expression of a father who has been told his children are gone, and has not yet processed the distance between that fact and every prior assumption about safety. He was on horseback in under 2 minutes. She went back to the barn and took the bay mare without stopping to saddle her properly. Bridle only, because there wasn't time, and because she'd ridden bareback often. enough to manage it, and she went out the north gate, at a pace that the mare matched without complaint, with the willingness of an animal that has decided to trust the person on her back. The north road ran through a long corridor of frozen scrub before it opened into the upper range. She pushed the mare hard through the corridor, scanning both sides, and it was the mare who found them first, the animal's head coming up and her ears going forward in the direction of a draw off the left side of the road. Particular attention of a horse that has heard something a human hasn't yet. Evelyn pulled left, into the draw down the slope, through a stand of bare cottonwoods. Murrow had the children on foot beside a horse she didn't recognize, a dark roan tied to one of the cottonwoods. He'd stopped here or been stopped by something. A thrown shoe by the look of the roan's lifted foreleg, and he had both children by the wrist, one on each side, and he was talking to them in the low, careful tone of a man trying to prevent noise. Clara was trying to pull free. She was not crying. She was pulling with the deliberate, methodical effort of a child who has decided crying is not useful and is focusing on what is. Samuel was watching Murrow with wide eyes and the expression of someone who is very scared and has decided to be very still. Murrow looked up when he heard the mare come through the trees. He registered Evelyn. Something moved across his face, the recalculation of someone whose plan has developed an unanticipated variable. "This doesn't involve you," he said. Evelyn stopped the mare 10 feet from him. She looked at Clara, then Samuel. "You all right?" she said, directing it at both of them, keeping her voice even. "Yes," Samuel said. "Very small." "Wrist hurts," Clara said, which was Clara's version of the same sentencer. She looked at Murrow. "Let go of them," she said. "I'm taking them to their aunt in Laramie," Murrow says it. "Gerald Pierce has a letter." "Gerald Pierce has no letter that means anything," she said. "The inquiry is closed. Whatever authority he told you he has, he doesn't have it." Murrow looked at her. He was calculating something. She could see it in the way his eyes moved, taking inventory of the situation. Her on a horse, him on foot with a lame animal, 2 children, the distance to the road. What she would do if he didn't let go. What he didn't know was that she had been calculating the same things, faster the moment she came through the trees. "Let go of them," she said again, "and we all go home, or don't, and wait for Cole Blackthorn to come up this road, which is going to happen in approximately 4 minutes. A sound from the road, hoofbeats, 2 horses, from the cadence. Murrow heard it too. He let go. Clara walked directly to the mare and put her hand on the animal's shoulder without being told to, the same gesture Evelyn had taught her in the barn, the flat palm contact that settled a nervous horse. Samuel walked to Clara's side and took her free hand with the automatic movement of a twin closing a gap. Murrow untied the roan and led the animal out of the draw on the far side, away from the road, moving quickly and without looking back. She let him go. She didn't have the means to hold him and didn't trust the situation to escalate further with the children right there. Cole came through the trees with Cass, a half-minute behind him. He took in the scene the children, standing beside Evelyn's mare, Murrow's tracks in the snow heading away, the lame roan's prints mixing with the others. He got off his horse and went to his children in 3 strides and crouched down in front of them in the snow without caring what it did to his trousers. He checked them over with his hands the way a man checks something precious for damage. Quick, thorough, trying not to show how afraid he was of what he might find. "You're all right," he said, which was half question and half the insistence of a man refusing the alternative. "My wrist hurts a little," Clara said. Cole took her wrist in both hands, checked it, held it. "I know," he said it. Like the 2 words were all he trusted himself to say right now. Samuel looked at Evelyn on the mare. "You came fast," he said. "The mare's quick," Evelyn said. "You didn't saddle her. Didn't have time." Samuel appeared to file this away, for future consideration, the way he filed everything. Then he looked at his father. "She came first," he said. "For you." Cole looked up at Evelyn from where he was crouched in the snow. The look lasted only a moment, the length of something passing between 2 people that doesn't need more time than that. Then he stood and put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Go home," he said. The ride back was quiet. Cole kept the children close on either side of him on the road, and Cass fell back to ride beside Evelyn with the comfortable silence of a man who understands that the most useful thing right now is to not be underfoot. The snow in the draw had taken their tracks, and Murrow's tracks with impartiality, covering everything the same way. Cass said, "Lo, Pierce is going to hear about this before the day's out." "He already knows," she said. "He sent Murrow." "I mean, he's going to hear it went wrong." Cass watched the road. Men like Pierce, when something goes wrong, they look for who to blame. "It won't be Murrow." "No," she agreed. "It'll be Ruth." "Ruth will fold," Evelyn said. "Or she won't. Either way, it's not the children she's coming for next time." She watched Cole on the road ahead, the two small shapes flanking him. "Past that now." Cass looked at her sidelong. "You sound sure of it." "I'm not sure of anything," she said. "But I know what a person looks like when they've run out of angles. Pierce has run out." He considered this. "And Murrow." Murrow made a calculation, and it didn't work out. "He'll find other work," she paused. "He's not evil. He's just for hire." Cass made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You're more forgiving than I'd be." "I'm not forgiving him," she said. "I just don't have the energy to stay angry at instruments. I save it for the people doing the aiming." They came back to the ranch in the late morning, the sky going the flat white of incoming weather, the kind of white that meant more snow before dark. The barn came into view first, then the house, the familiar configuration of buildings and fence lines that she had now looked at every day for 3 months, and which had in that time transformed from a place she'd arrived at into something she was less sure how to categorize. Cole helped the children down and sent them to the house with instructions to tell Mrs. Alcott what had happened, which was his way of giving the older woman something useful to do with the fear she was clearly still carrying from the morning. Good at that. She'd noticed finding ways to redirect distress into action, which was a skill of someone who had learned to manage a household full of people and emotions while keeping himself separate enough from both to function. He came to the barn after the horses were seen to, which was the right order of priorities, and they both knew it. She was checking the mare's legs. She'd pushed her hard and wanted to be sure when he came in and leaned against the stall door in the way that meant a conversation was coming, that he'd been composing on the walk over. "I should have seen Murrow coming," he said. "So should I," she said. "You found the children." The mare found them. She checked the near foreleg, ran her hand down to the fetlock. "Clean. I just steered." "Evelyn," he said her name the way he said things he'd decided not to soften. "I need to say something." She stood up. She turned to face him. She gave him the same thing she'd given. Frightened horses 100 times. Her full, quiet attention. The absence of anything that would make it harder to come forward. "What you've built here," he said, and then stopped, which was unusual for him. He was a man of incomplete sentences, leaving the endings off the difficult things. But this one he'd started and seemed determined to finish. "What you've given this place. I didn't know it was possible. I didn't know a person could walk in with nothing and change the character of something just by being in it." She looked at him. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I know," she said, not unkindly. "The children need," he stopped again. Tried a different way in. "I need to ask you to consider something, and I need you to know that whatever you say, your place here is secure. This is not a condition. It's a," he seemed to lose the word. "Question," she said. "Yes," he looked at her steadily. "I'm asking if you would consider staying, not as a hand." He paused. "I don't know what the right word is for what I'm asking, and I'm not going to put the wrong word on it and have it mean less than I mean. But I'm asking you to consider it." The barn was very quiet. The mare moved behind her, a soft shifting of weight. Outside the sky was pressing down with its coming snow, and the light through the gaps in the boards was the particular thin gray of a February afternoon that knows it doesn't have long. She thought about Harold on the porch in November. She thought about the road northwest with the wind in her face. She thought about $7.40 and a lock of hair and a pair of boots with a separating heel and the quality of nothing that had been all she was carrying when she walked up this road. She thought about a child's hand finding hers in the dark, about a man's grip steadying her in a stall at midnight, about the mare leaning into her shoulder while the storm pressed at the walls. "I'll consider it," she said. It was not the answer he might have hoped for, and not the answer she might have hoped to give, but it was the honest one, and between two people who had come to trust each other, primarily through their honesty, it was enough for today. Cole nodded. He straightened from the stall door. He started toward the barn's exit and then paused, not turning around, the same way he'd paused at the barn door the first night she'd walked Jasper back from the edge of a colic. "The lawyer says Pierce's husband is going to face a separate inquiry," he said, "about the magistrate and the money. Fenwick filed the information last week." "I didn't know that," she said. "I know you didn't." He paused. "I wanted you to know that the aiming is being dealt with." He went out. She stood in the barn and listened to his footsteps, crossed the yard, listened to the kitchen, the set door, listened to the barn settle around her with the familiar sounds of horses and wind and the creak of boards carrying weight they'd carried for years. She put her hand in her coat pocket, felt the flour sack cloth, felt the folded edge of Clara's drawing. She had told him she would consider it. She had been considering it, she understood, since approximately the night she had sat in a chair in his son's room with his daughter asleep against her shoulder and watched him fall asleep still holding the boy's hand. What she was actually considering was not whether, but how. How you walk back into a life after you have survived the ruin of one. How you trust ground that has held you for 3 months when you know better than most people what ground can do when it gives out. How you let something matter again when you know exactly what the cost of losing it is. She did not have answers to these questions yet. She suspected the answers were not the kind you found and then possessed, but the kind you kept arriving at over and over. Says every morning when you got up before light and went into the barn and did the work of the day. She checked the last of the mare's legs clean. No heat. The animal had come through the morning without damage and straightened and looked at the barn around her. Stalls she had cleaned every morning for 3 months. Jasper in his stall at the end, showing his nose over the door in the manner of a horse who has decided she's worth greeting. The place where she'd hung the new latch on the first week, the loft above, with its banked stove and its 2 blankets and the slight smell of wood smoke and hay. It was hers, in the way that things become yours not through ownership, but through care. She went up to the loft and changed her coat and looked at Clara's drawing. One more time the 4 figures in the yard, imperfect proportions, the sky full of generous detail, and then folded it back along its creases and put it away, and went down to start the afternoon's work, which was always the same as the morning's work, which was always the same as the work of any other day. You stayed, you kept your hands busy, you did the next thing, and sometimes, if you were patient enough, the thing that had been cold and afraid and locked against the world decided, in its own time and on its own terms, to let the warmth back in. She gave him her answer on a Sunday, not because Sunday was meaningful to her in any particular way, but because it was the day the considering finally ran out of road. She had been carrying the question Cole had put to her for 11 days, through the rest of February, through the slow turn toward March, through mornings in the barn and evenings at the kitchen table, and the long middle hours of the night when she lay in the loft linening, doing what Wyoming does in late winter, which is remind you that it isn't finished with you yet. 11 days of turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, checking the weight of it, the edges, what it feels like against your palm. The considering had not produced certainty. She'd stopped expecting certainty from herself years ago. What it had produced was the recognition that she had already answered the question in every way that mattered with her hands, with her time, part of herself she'd kept under glass since Thomas died, and which had been coming through the glass inch by inch since November without her permission. The words were just the last part. The words were just catching up to what was already true. She found Cole in the study on Sunday morning, doing the accounts he did every week, the ledger open, the ink bottle uncapped. Same quiet industry she'd come to associate with Sunday mornings, the way you associate certain smells with certain rooms. She knocked on the open door. He looked up. "I'll stay," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face, not surprise, because she didn't think he was surprised, but the particular expression of a man whose private arithmetic has just been confirmed by an external source. "Put down the pen." "All right," he said. It was not a romantic declaration. Neither of them was built for romantic declarations, and if they had been, this would have been the wrong time and place for them. A man at a ledger, a woman in the doorway of a study still wearing her work coat, Sunday morning light coming in flat and gray through the single window. But it was real, which is rarer than romantic, and worth considerably more. "There are things we need to talk about," she said. "Practical things, I know." "I won't be invisible," she said. "I won't live in the barn and eat at the house and have no defined position here. Whatever this is, it needs to be clear. For the children's sake, if nothing else." He nodded. What would make it clear? She'd thought about this. Formal arrangement. Not sentiment. For legal standing, she chose her words carefully. "I've had property taken from me because I had no legal standing. I won't go through that again." Something moved in his jaw. Not offense, she watched to make sure it wasn't offense, and it wasn't. It was the expression of a man who is absorbing the weight of a thing rather than resisting it. He understood what she was saying. He understood it well enough to know it wasn't about him. "Fenwick can draw it up," he said. "When you're ready." "When we're ready," she said. He picked up the pen again, then set it back down. "The children will need to be told." "Yes. I'll talk to them today." "I'd like to be there," she said. "Not to manage it, just to be there." He thought about this. "All right," he said. "Supper." She went back to the barn. She worked through the morning, the same way she'd worked through every morning, since November, the same stalls, the same horses, the same sequence of tasks. She'd learned so thoroughly that her hands moved through them without consultation. But the work felt different in a way she couldn't have described precisely. Not lighter, it wasn't a romantic feeling, a weight lifted, a burden-gone thing. More like the difference between carrying something toward a destination and carrying the same thing with no particular destination in mind. The weight was the same. The orientation was different. Jasper put his nose over the door, and she stopped and rubbed it and thought about the first morning. She'd walked him out of a colic in the dark, the two of them going back and forth in the cold barn aisle with nobody watching. She'd been here 6 weeks when that happened. It was March now. She'd been here 4 months, and the distance between the woman who'd stood in the barn doorway with a single bag in November and the woman standing here now was not the distance of time. It was the distance of everything that had happened in the time, which was a different kind of measurement entirely. The supper that evening had the particular charged quality of meals at which something important is going to be said, and everyone at the table knows it, except possibly the children, who are the ones it's going to be said to. Samuel was in good spirits. He'd spent the afternoon with Denny, learning something about rope work, and was still talking about it, the way he talked about things that interested him, which was continuously and in granular detail. Clara was quiet, which was normal, but she was also watching both Cole and Evelyn with the heightened attention of a child whose observational instruments have detected an anomaly in the atmosphere. Cole waited until Samuel had finished the rope account, which took through most of the meal, and then he set down his fork and looked at his children with the expression she'd come to recognize as his attempt at openness not natural to him, but chosen. "I want to talk to you both about something," he said. Samuel closed his mouth and looked at his father. Clara put her fork down. "You know Mrs. Hartwell has been here since November, Cole. You know what she's meant to this place, to the barn, and to the work." He paused. "And to us." Samuel glanced at Evelyn. She kept her face still and present, the way she kept it with the horses not performing calm, just being there. "I've asked her to stay," Cole said. "Not as a ranch hand. Part of us. The table was quiet. Samuel said, "Like permanently?" "Yes." Samuel absorbed this. He looked at Evelyn with the directness that was one of his most consistent qualities. "You want to?" he said, as if his father's account of the situation might be missing an important variable. "I want to," she said. He appeared satisfied. "Okay," he said and picked up his fork. Clara had not said anything. She was looking at the table in front of her with the concentrated expression of someone running sums. Cole watched her. "Clara," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. They waited. Evelyn was aware of the wait, of the waiting, aware that Clara's response mattered in a way that couldn't be forced or negotiated, that it had to come from wherever Clara herself kept the things that mattered. "When Mama died," Clara said, without looking up, "you said she wasn't coming back. You said some things that happen don't unhappen." "That's right," Cole said quietly. "So she's not this isn't instead of her." "No," Cole said. "It isn't instead of anything." Clara looked at Evelyn. The look was long and direct and measuring in the way of all Clara's looks, and Evelyn held it without flinching and without offering anything except her full, honest attention. "You didn't try to be like her," Clara said. It came out like an observation rather than a compliment, which made it more valuable than a compliment. "No," Evelyn said. "I'm not her. I'm not trying to be." Clara looked at the table again. Then she said, "The drawing I gave you, the one with all four of us. I have it," Evelyn said. "In my coat." Clara nodded slowly. "I made it before he asked you," she said. "I made it because I already thought of it that way. 4 of us." She looked up. "So I already decided." Evelyn sat with this for a moment. She thought about an 8-year-old making a drawing in the dark because she was afraid someone would leave, carrying it downstairs in the night, pressing it into the hands of a woman she'd known 4 months and had let in closer than she'd let anyone since she was 5 years old. She thought about all the ways courage shows up in the world that nobody writes ballads about. "Then we're decided," Evelyn said. Samuel, who had been eating through all of this with the pragmatism of a child who had reached his conclusion early and saw no reason to make the waiting longer, looked up and said, "Can I have more bread?" Cole laughed. It came out of him the way Samuel had noticed at breakfast, unplanned, unguarded, the laugh of a man who has been given something he'd stopped expecting to receive. It lasted only a moment, but it was real, which was the only thing that mattered about laughter. Evelyn reached across the table and put the bread in front of Samuel without being asked. The formal inquiry into Gerald Pierce's conduct at the county magistrate's office concluded in the 3rd week of March. Evelyn read about it the way she read most things that came out of the legal process in summary from Cass, who had a source at the grain exchange who kept him informed, which was a relationship she'd stopped asking about because some information supply chains were better left unexamined. What Fenwick's filing had set in motion, it turned out, was larger than any of them had known. The relationship between Pierce and the magistrate was not the only such relationship. Pierce maintained there were 2 others in 2 adjacent counties, a network of small corruptions that had existed long enough to become invisible because the people who might have challenged them had lacked either the standing or the documentation. Evelyn's records and Fenwick's methodical mind had provided both. Gerald Pierce was removed from his position on the county trade board and faced a formal financial inquiry. The magistrate who had authorized Hollis's investigation was censured and removed from his position pending review. Dex Murrow left Grover's flat sometime in early March and was not heard from again, at least not in this county. Ruth Pierce remained in Grover's flat. She would remain there for years. Evelyn would see her in the dry goods store and the occasional public gathering, and they would acknowledge each other with the minimal courtesy of people who have been through something together that neither of them intends to discuss. Ruth was diminished by the inquiry's fallout, not destroyed, and Evelyn was neither satisfied nor unsatisfied by this. She had not wanted destruction. She had wanted it to stop, and it stopped. That was enough. Cole went to Laramie in the last week of March and came back with papers that Fenwick had drawn up. They were not marriage papers that conversation had been. And they'd both agreed that the formal arrangement they needed now was the legal one, the one that established her standing on the property, and in relation to the children, and that the other thing was its own question for its own time. Papers established Evelyn Hartwell as a named party in the management of Blackthorn Ranch, with defined rights and responsibilities, witnessed and registered with the territorial office. She signed them at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, with Samuel watching over her shoulder, and Clara sitting across from her with her chin in her hands, watching the pen. "Just your name," Samuel said, studying the signature. "That's all a signature is," she said. "It looks like a E and then a lot of lines." "Samuel," Cole said. "It does, though." Evelyn looked at her signature. "It does," she agreed. "I've always had bad penmanship." Clara said, "Mine's worse. Your A's are good," Evelyn said. Clara considered this. "My A's are good," she confirmed. Cole signed beneath her. His signature was not notably better than hers, which she found obscurely comforting. He blotted it, closed the document, slid it across the table. Fenwick would file it. The territorial office would record it. Somewhere in the machinery of the legal world, the fact of her being here would become the kind of fact that could not simply be removed because someone with money and a grievance decided they wanted it removed. She thought about Harold on the porch in November. She thought about the surveyor and the document, and Thomas's signature, and the neighbors in their yards who watched without speaking. She thought, not this time. Spring came to Wyoming, the way spring always comes to Wyoming reluctantly. In pieces, the cold releasing its grip finger by finger over the course of weeks before it let go entirely. The snow went from the south-facing slopes first, then the yard, then the north side of the barn where it lingered longest, clinging to the shadow of the eaves in thin strips well into April, as if it was still making a point. Evelyn watched the season change from the barn doorway. Every morning, same doorway she'd stood in on the first night of November when Cole had met her in the dark and told her the pay was $4 a week. She thought sometimes about that woman, the one who'd arrived with the single bag and the worn boots and the $7.40, and she didn't recognize her exactly, but she understood her. She understood the particular combination of depletion and stubbornness that had kept her moving up the road when it would have been easier, in practical terms, to stop. She understood what it was like to have nothing left but the decision to keep going, and to make that decision not because you are brave, but because the only alternative is to stop being yourself entirely, which is a different kind of death and one that takes much longer. She had been wrong about one thing. She had thought, when she arrived here, that she was looking for a place to survive in. She had not been looking for a place to live in, because she had lost confidence. Somewhere in the years of Thomas's illness and the small graves and Harold's pointing finger, that living in a place was something she was still allowed to want. She had been wrong about that. The wrongness of it had been demonstrated to her not through argument or persuasion, but through daily accumulation, through the weight of a sleeping child against her shoulder, and a man's hand steadying hers in the dark and the bay mare leaning into her palm, and the sound of Cole laughing at supper in the unplanned way that meant it was real. You don't recover from grief by deciding to recover from it. You don't rebuild a life by deciding to rebuild one. You do it by showing up every morning and doing the next thing, and one day you look around and the thing you've been building is already there. And it has been there for longer than you knew, and the only thing that's changed is that you've finally looked at it. In April, Cass pulled her aside after the morning work and told her he was planning to retire at the end of the season. He was 61 years old, and his knees had been arguing with him since before she arrived, and his sister in Denver had a spare room and a less hostile climate, and he had decided, he said, that the time had come to stop winning arguments with the Wyoming winter on sheer stubbornness and starts choosing his battles more selectively. She looked at him. "I'm going to miss you," she said. "I know," he said, without the false modesty of people who deflect that kind of honesty. He was too old and too direct for that. You'll manage. I know I'll manage, she said. I'll still miss you. He nodded. He turned his hat in his hands, which was the gesture she'd come to associate with him, saying something he'd thought about carefully. When you came here in November, he said, I thought you'd last 2 weeks. Not because you weren't capable, because capable people leave when a place is difficult enough. This place isn't difficult, she said. It was in November. Thought about November. Yes, she said, it was. You didn't leave. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has been watching people for 61 years and has strong opinions about what he's seen. That's not nothing, Evelyn. A lot of people can handle things when they're good. The ones who stay when it's bad, those are the ones that matter. She didn't know what to say to that, which was unusual for her. She settled for, Thank you, Cass. Don't thank me, he said. I didn't do anything except watch, and tell Denny to stop asking you personal questions in the first week. She laughed. It came out of her the same way Cole's laugh had come out of him at supper, unplanned, real. You did that? He was going to ask about your finances. I told him it was none of his business and also inadvisable. Cass put his hat back on. He's a good boy, just nosy. He walked back toward the bunkhouse with his slow, deliberate gait, the gait of someone whose knees were in an ongoing negotiation with the rest of him, and she watched him go and felt the specific ache of knowing a good person is leaving a place, and that the place will be different without them. Denny would take on more responsibility in Cass's absence. He'd grown into his work over the winter, in the way young men sometimes do, when circumstances require it, less perpetually surprised, more capable of completing a task without needing to report on it. He was not Cass and would not be Cass, but he was becoming something solid in his own right, and that was its own kind of good. Cole hired a new hand in May, a taciturn man from Nebraska named Arlen, who worked hard and talked little, and got along well with the horses, which were Evelyn's primary criteria for whether she trusted a person. The ranch moved into summer the way it moved into everything, by adjusting, adapting, reconfiguring around what had changed and what had stayed the same. What stayed the same? The work, the horses, the daily sequence of tasks that structured the hours into something navigable. What had changed? Everything around the edges of the work, all the space between the tasks that had once been empty and was now full of voices, of argument about small things, of the particular noise that two children make when they have decided a place is safe enough to be loud in. Samuel discovered in June that he had a talent for working with the horses that went beyond ordinary interest. He had her gift for reading them, for seeing the angle of an ear or the set of a shoulder, and knowing what it meant before it became a problem. She started teaching him properly, not the incidental lessons of the barn doorway, but real instruction, systematic and patient, the way her father had taught her. He absorbed it with the same focused seriousness he applied to everything he decided was worth understanding. Clara's talent, it turned out, was for the record-keeping. She'd watched Evelyn maintain the ranch records through the inquiry, had seen how a careful daily log could become a legal instrument, and had decided this was a form of power worth mastering. She started keeping her own records, not official ones, just the observations she'd always made, now written down. The horses, the weather, the small events of ranch days. She had a writer's instinct for the specific detail that made a general truth visible. She's going to be formidable, Cole said one evening, looking at something Clara had written in one of the blank account books she'd appropriated. She already is, Evelyn said. He looked at her. I know, he said. I just keep being surprised by how much. She understood that. Parenthood, she'd come to think, was the ongoing experience of being surprised by people you thought you knew completely. The children were themselves entirely, irrevocably, in ways that exceeded anything you'd planned for them, and the surprise of it was not a problem to be solved, but a quality of the thing itself. You didn't know who they were going to be. You just made the ground solid enough under them that they had somewhere to stand while they figured it out. She had not expected to find this out. She had not expected, when she walked up the road in November with her single bag and her $7 and her private freight of loss, to arrive anywhere that taught her something new about what she was capable of. She thought she knew the full inventory of herself by then. She'd been wrong about that too. The conversation about marriage happened in July, Tuesday evening, that was indistinguishable from any other Tuesday evening, except that it happened to be the one where Cole said what he'd been working toward since March, with the methodical patience of a man who knows that the right thing is not the first time you want to say it. They were on the porch after supper. The children were inside. She could hear Samuel doing something inadvisable in the upper hallway, and Clara periodically telling him to stop. The evening was warm in the way Wyoming evenings in July are warm, which is incompletely, with the suggestion of the cold waiting at the edges of the season. Sky was doing something with color that she'd learned in 4 months of Wyoming evenings was one of the things the territory did without apology. The light going through its changes with a generosity that felt sometimes like the land's way of balancing the account against all its other austerities. Fenwick says the spring filing went through, Cole said. He was looking at the yard, the familiar posture of a man who says important things to the middle distance before he says them, to the person. I know, he wrote. So it's settled. It's settled, she said. Pause. Inside, Samuel made a sound that suggested the inadvisable thing had not gone well. I want to ask you something else, Cole said. She waited, turned to look at her. She had not seen him look nervous before, not anxious, which was different, but actually uncertain in the way that removes whatever performance a person is usually putting on and leaves just the person underneath. He was not a handsome man in the easy sense, but he was a real one, and there were worse things to build a life with. I want to ask you to marry me, he said, not for the legal situation that's done, not for the children, though not only for them. He stopped, started again, which was unusual for him. He usually trusted his first attempt. I want to ask, because I don't want to spend the next 30 years of this ranch and this family not having asked, because you are the reason this place makes sense again. Not the barn work, though you're better at it than anyone I've hired in 15 years, but the rest. He seemed to realize he was losing the thread of it and made a visible decision to stop before he made it worse. Will you? She looked at him. She thought about the first night she'd sat across a kitchen table from him, and he'd said, "Don't cause trouble, Mrs. Hartwell," and she'd said, "I never do," which was only partly true, and they both knew it by now. She thought about Jasper in the cold, dark barn aisle, and Samuel's questions about everything, and Clara's flat palm offering of a drawing that wasn't ready. She thought about the flour sack cloth in her coat pocket, which she had carried for 3 years, which she had taken out every night on the road and held in both hands, which had been the one thing she would not let the frontier take from her. She thought about the fact that she had been wrong before, about what she was looking for and where she'd find it. Yes, she said. Cole let out a breath. He'd clearly been holding for longer than this conversation. He nodded once. The way he nodded when something important had been settled and he was putting it in the part of his mind where settled things went. He was not a man who celebrated things in the moment she'd learned that about him, and it didn't bother her, because she wasn't that kind of person either. They were both the kind of people who took a thing in quietly and then carried it forward. He reached over and took her hand. Just that. Not with drama, not with declaration. Just his hand covering hers on the porch rail. In the July evening, the warm weight of it, the steadiness. Inside, the inadvisable thing Samuel had been doing apparently resolved itself because the noise stopped. Clara said something short and probably accurate, and then everything was quiet. They were married in September by the territorial judge, who came through Grover's flat on his circuit in a ceremony that lasted 20 minutes and was attended by Cass, who had come back from Denver for the occasion. Because he said his sister's company was fine, but he had unfinished business, and Denny and Arlen and several families from surrounding ranches who had, over the course of the spring and summer, revised their opinions about Evelyn Hartwell in the direction of the actual evidence, rather than Ruth Pierce's account of it. Ruth Pierce was not there. This was not commented upon. Clara wore a blue dress that she had chosen herself, and that she stood very straight in, with the gravity of a child who has decided This is an important occasion and is going to honor it with appropriate posture. Samuel wore his good shirt and lost one of the buttons from it before the ceremony began, which Evelyn reattached with the small kit she'd taken to carrying in her coat pocket, because Samuel was that kind of child, and he thanked her with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone who finds it unsurprising that the problem has been solved. She stood beside Cole in front of the judge, with the morning light coming through the windows of the Grover's meeting hall, and she was not a young bride. She was 34 years old, and she had buried a husband and 2 children and turned off the land she'd kept for 11 years, and walked up a road in November with nothing to show for a decade of her life, except the knowledge that she could survive more than she'd thought possible. She was not arriving at this without weight. She was arriving with all of it, the same way she'd arrived at everything, carrying what she had, going forward anyway. She had learned something. In 4 months of Wyoming, and the long, slow work of becoming part of something again that she hadn't known before. She'd thought that surviving the worst things made you harder. She'd thought that was the transaction you gave up the soft parts and got endurance in return. She'd thought the woman she was at 34 was necessarily less than the woman she'd been at 22, because so much had been taken. She had been wrong about all of it. The worst things didn't make you harder. They made you more precise. They stripped out the parts of you that could only survive easy conditions and left the parts that could survive anything. And those parts, it turned out, were the most important ones: the capacity to work without reward, to stay without guarantee, keep your hands flat and your presence steady and wait for the frightened thing to come around. The capacity to hold a child in the dark, the capacity to walk a sick horse back from the edge, the capacity to make a record of the truth in your careful handwriting and lay it on the desk and say, this is what actually happened here. She had not lost herself in the losing. She had found out what she was made of. Those are not the same thing, and the difference between them is the whole story. When the judge asked her, she said yes in a clear voice that didn't waver, and Cole said yes in the way Cole said important things, which was once and without decoration, and that was that. Cass at the back of the room was not crying. He was also not entirely not crying. He was looking at the window in the way of a man who has decided that something outside requires his full attention. The supper that evening, a long table in the yard, because the hall was too small and the September weather was, for once, cooperating. Samuel gave a toast. He had prepared it, which everyone could tell, because he read a piece of paper that he'd folded small enough to fit in his shirt pocket, which explained what he'd been working on in the bunkhouse the previous 3 evenings. He read it with the determined concentration of an 8-year-old who has decided he is going to do this right and will not be deterred by the experience of his own nervousness. What it said, in summary, was that his father had been sad for a long time, and his sister had been sad, and he had been sad, and that when Evelyn came in November, the sadness had not disappeared. Because things don't disappear like that, but it had gotten smaller, and the space around it had gotten larger, and now the space was large enough that you could live in it without the sadness being the main. He said he thought that was what she'd done. He said he thought that was enough reason for a toast. He had not shown it to Clara or his father before he read it. When he finished, Clara said quietly, "That's exactly right." Cole said nothing. He was looking at his son with the expression of a man who has been seen more clearly than he expected to be by someone he had been underestimating. Evelyn looked at Samuel, this boy, with his uneven collar and his reattached button and his piece of paper folded small enough to fit in his shirt pocket, and she thought about courage again, the way she'd been thinking about it all year, in all its unlauded varieties. Courage of an 8-year-old getting up in front of people and reading something true. Courage of a girl making a drawing in the dark because she was afraid of loss and decided to name the thing she wanted instead. The courage of a man who had built walls for 3 years and then, one careful inch at a time, decided to stop. The courage of a woman who had walked up a road in November with nothing and decided that nothing was not the end of the account. just the current balance. She raised her glass to Samuel. He raised his back with the gravity of someone completing a formal transaction. The evening went on. The light went the way it always went through its changes, generous and unhurried, the way the sky over Wyoming does when it's in a good mood, which it isn't always but was tonight. The children stayed up later than they were supposed to, and nobody enforced the usual hour, because some evenings are for usual hours and some are not, and the difference between them is something you know when you're in it. Later, when the guests had gone, and the children were finally in bed, and the yard was quiet, Evelyn stood at the barn door for a moment before going in. She did it every night, had done it since November, stood in the doorway for a few seconds, and listened to the barn breathe and looked at the yard and the house and the fence lines running out into the dark. She put her hand in her coat pocket. The flour sack cloth was there. She took it out and held it in both hands. The same gesture, the same weight, the same square of folded cloth she'd carried since the morning they put her son in the ground. She held it for a long time in the doorway of the barn in the September night. She did not open it. She didn't need to open it to know what was inside. She knew the weight of it, the texture of the cloth, the way it had worn soft at the folds from being held so many times. She knew what it meant and what it cost and what it had kept her connected to through the years when there wasn't much else to hold on to. She put it back in her pocket. She had not stopped loving what she'd lost. She would not stop. That was not what moving forward meant. It didn't mean the losses became smaller or the grief became less true. It meant the space around them became larger, the way Samuel had said, large enough to live in. Large enough that the sadness was not the main thing anymore. The main thing was the barn around her, warm and familiar. The main thing was Jasper putting his nose over the door in the dark. Because Jasper never entirely gave up on the possibility that someone might appear with something worth eating. The main thing was the light in the upstairs window of the house, going out, which meant Clara had finally put her book down. The main thing was Cole's voice, from the direction of the porch, saying her name, just that, just Evelyn, the word that meant, come in, the night's getting cold. There's no reason to stand out there alone. She was not alone. She had not been alone for some time now. It had taken her a while to let herself know it. She took one more look at the yard, the fence lines, the dark house, stars above the ridge, in the way they only look in September before the cold brings the clouds back. And then she stepped out of the barn doorway and crossed the yard toward the house. The woman who had arrived with nothing was still carrying everything she'd ever lost. She always would be. That was the price of having loved things, and it was a price she would pay again without hesitation, because the alternative was to have gone through the world without loving anything, and that was not surviving. That was just not dying. She went inside, and the door closed, and the light in the downstairs window stayed on for a long time that night, long enough that Cass, in the bunkhouse, saw it on his way to the outhouse and smiled to himself in the dark, in the private way of old men who have watched a good thing come together and are satisfied by the arithmetic of it. The ranch that had been full of silence became in time full of other things. Not perfect things, not easy things. Life on the frontier in 1887 was not a soft proposition, and the years that followed had their difficulties, hard winters, dry summers, 10,000 ordinary crises of running land and raising children and making a life with another person who is not you and never will be. Cole remained a man of incomplete sentences and long silences. Evelyn remained a woman who trusted work more than words and who would never be entirely easy with being cared for. Samuel grew into someone surprising and specific and entirely himself. Clara grew into someone formidable, as predicted, and never stopped keeping records. The bay mare had a foal in the spring, a leggy gray thing that Clara named without consultation, and that Evelyn helped into the world in the early hours of a March morning, while Cole held the lantern, and Samuel watched from the stall door with wide eyes, and Clara wrote down the time and the conditions in her account book because Clara was Clara and always would be. It was not a perfect life. It was a real one, which is rarer and harder and worth considerably more. The widow who had arrived at Blackthorn Ranch with a single bag and $7.40 and a lock of hair and a lifetime of grief did not become someone who had never lost anything. She became someone who had lost more than most and kept going anyway, and who had found something in the keeping going, things she hadn't known she was looking for. That is the only kind of story worth telling. Not the one where nothing bad happens. The one where the bad things happen and you keep going, and the going turns out to be enough, and more than enough. And someday you stand in a barn doorway on a September night and look at the lit window of the house you have earned by daily action and daily presence and the unglamorous courage of just staying. And you understand that this is what home feels like, not a destination, a direction. The one you chose to keep walking in, even when the road was frozen and the bag was heavy and the wind was coming from the north. Especially then,